Okay, everybody, if you'd please take your seats. Samir. Full disclosure, in case you don't know, I work for ESET. Lysa works for ESET, but that's not why I'm expecting a good talk from you.
Wait, yes.
That was your introduction.
Oh, okay, cool. All right. So my motivation for doing this talk is to address the problems and complaints that I've heard over the years from people who've been getting into the industry, as well as people finding more senior level positions. And this is such a new industry, nothing is clearly set in stone, and that causes problems as well as benefits. It's not clear, because it's not set in stone, we have a tendency to repeat things that work well once, which leads us to having a large percentage of one small subset of people. I think we all have a gut understanding that no one of us can know everything about security, or even something specific like malware research. There are a lot of things to know and a lot of things to experience. The more different brains and experiences that we can put together, the stronger and more resilient we all are. It's important to keep this in mind when we're putting together security teams. The more different people we can put in one group, the more we can combine all of that knowledge, the better we're able to see into the dark corners of the internet. The process of including more people is about improving the way we do things for everyone. I hope to help you step back and view things differently so that we can all examine what dark corners we might be missing from our own hiring practices. Whether or not you believe our talent pipeline is too thin, the fact is it leaks like a sieve. There are quite a few systemic problems which boil down to the effect of common mistakes being amplified when they're all combined. In the US, as in many other countries, the move to incorporate computer skills has been very late in coming, and in low-income and rural areas, it's been especially so. Teachers have little understanding of how computers work, much less how to instruct kids how to use them safely. This means a lot of the kids who are getting to college are already way behind their peers in terms of being comfortable with technology. These kids are likely to shy away from getting computer science degrees. And there's a feeling that computing and security in general are more like a magical security skill or like wizard skill that only a select few people can do. While we might like to think that we're some elite minority of people who can do what we do, the fact is there are a lot of people who could if they had the appropriate training. And we compound this further by setting up crazy hurdles that people have to jump through to get a job, so they may not even enter the industry if they do get the right qualifications. Once they do get hired, a lot of people in the most underrepresented groups end up leaving mid-career. So what can we do to change education problems, even if they're out of our direct control? We can work with education groups to help bring kids or even mid-career switchers into the industry. That can also include volunteering or giving money to organizations to help kids get computer education. You can talk to your local legislators about making computer literacy a mandatory standard for kids in school, providing CS certifications for teachers, or about creating technology internship programs. Currently in the US, only 9 states allow computer science classes to count as a math or science credit. The availability of both introductory and advanced placement CS classes is decreasing right now. In both K-12 and many colleges and universities, computer science lags way behind the current practices in teaching, which is project-based learning that relates a subject to kids' existing knowledges and interests. This reinforces a view of computing as lonely and boring. I think we all understand that computing can be really fun, and can be a useful tool, but it needs to be taught that way. You can talk to your local university about what you need from students. You can also hire students as interns or apprentices. And until higher ed is a better return on investment for the majority of people, or until they start preparing students to jump into positions without additional training, reconsider what qualifications you're asking for applicants. There are lots of ways to improve inclusion. The most obvious is improving the percentage of women in your organization. The ideal for inclusion is to aim for a similar percentage within your company as is in your customer base or in your local area. We've probably all heard women make up only 11% of the workforce in security in the US, while women make up almost 50% of the total workforce. That's kind of a huge gap with a lot of room for improvement. But gender isn't the only way that representation is skewed, not by a long shot. Most of these groupings are pretty self-explanatory, though neurodiversity may be a new term for most folks. The term includes a wide variety of different types of mental operating systems, like with unfortunate medical names like autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit disorder, dyslexia, aphantasia, amusia, etc. From a threat modeling perspective, each of these demographics will have different security and privacy concerns, most of which won't necessarily be obvious to people outside of these groups. Each will have different strengths to bring to the table. Because the neurodivergence bit is still so poorly understood and influences so much of how we interact with the world, I'd like to clarify it a little further. We're still just barely starting to learn how everyone's brains actually work quite differently rather than just assuming we all have the same thinky bits. For example, aphantasia is lack of mental images, which is a condition that has only been studied in the last few years, while amusia is a difference in auditory pitch perception that was discovered less than 2 decades ago. Both of these things seem pretty simple, but they can have pretty surprising and far-reaching effects, such as in how we understand instructions or how we perceive tone of voice. Learning disorders like dyslexia have been known about for quite a while, but most of us have a pretty passing understanding of what ADHD and autism are. But even then, there's a lot of misinformation about what these things actually mean. For instance, most people have heard that autism and ADHD mostly affect males, and that is mostly because the original studies only included males, and a small subset of males at that. The way it appears in females is different enough that typically only the girls that are most profoundly affected are the ones who are likely to get the right diagnosis. The reason there's been a rise in the number of people being diagnosed is simply because diagnostic criteria, likewise, are not set in stone, they're not well known, and they're not completely nailed down yet. In the general population, especially among women and minority communities, learning disorders such as ADHD and autism and dyslexia are underdiagnosed. So it's likely that some of you in the audience are neurodivergent and don't know it yet. The more we find out, the more it looks like there's no so-called normal brain. Each of us has our unique combination of strengths and weaknesses. So things we can do to help people with different neurotypes are not just something we do to accommodate 1 or 2 people. Being considerate of each other's mental operating system is likely to help a lot of us. The main thing to be aware of is that other people don't process information the same way that we do. Don't assume someone's terseness or lack of eye contact is because they're being rude. Don't assume that someone who's always running late is being disrespectful. People with sensory processing issues may be overwhelmed by too much noise or light, or they may be distractible by when they have too little input. Someone may prefer to communicate over email versus phone calls or vice versa. Sometimes it's helpful to have instructions in writing or as a diagram. Some folks have difficulty prioritizing input and may need additional information about what's most important. So please ask. Some of us take the words very literally and need help identifying when things are not as rigid as we assume. So please ask questions early and often. It's better to err on the side of being very clear and explicit than double checking to make sure your words have been received the way you intended them. And speaking of how the world appears different to everyone, simple and maybe unintuitive things are critical in making things accessible for different people. Without having lived the experience, it may be very difficult to get a full sense of how things can be different for someone else. For example, if you want to attract a different group, say you want to make a product more usable for people who are visually challenged, and you're having a hard time getting people who have this experience so they know, what accommodations need to be made to make things more usable. And it could be that the area around your office is really hard to navigate if you have vision challenges, so it might be that you're having a hard time reaching people in that group because it's difficult to navigate to your physical office. The basic idea is that if there are groups you're having a hard time reaching, it's always a good idea to consult individuals, to ask questions to help elucidate things that might not seem obvious. And please listen to the answers. Now, part of the pipeline, improving the pipeline for security is addressing our image. I mentioned before the weird idea that only a select few people are capable of doing our jobs. I was recently talking to someone who is trying to convince her son to get into security. And this is a kid who at 17, having never touched a car before, decided that he wanted his automatic car to be a manual car. And it's something he wanted, he learned how to do it. This kid is clearly curious. He obviously loves to learn. He thought he's better with hardware than mathematics, and he has no college degrees, so he couldn't do security. I'm not exactly a traditional security candidate either. No one would have ever said, hey, kid who's taking too many art classes, hey, let's go stare at a hex editor all day. I would never have chosen security as a career had I not had a chance to try it out first. I fell into my first job in this business, and I found out after the fact that it was a good fit. Much like improving education, part of our efforts for improving the image of security is actually getting people from different groups into the community, creating or funding existing scholarships for conferences, helping to make sure people from underrepresented groups are included, etc. And by improving the community, I mean improving safety for everyone. Like, for example, creating and enforcing codes of conduct, like the one VB did this year, making sure more types of people who are included as speakers at conferences, and standing up for people who are on the receiving end of jerkish behavior. Parts of the security industry have historically had very hostile culture towards everyone, especially newcomers and women. It's kind of ridiculous to think that we're going to get lots of new people if new people are routinely hassled. A code of conduct should be about establishing norms of behavior rather than creating rules and regulations. Those can easily be weaponized against people who are not part of the majority. Codes of conduct should be created by as diverse a group as you can find, whether internally or finding people outside of your organization. It shouldn't be the creation of a bunch of lawyers who are just looking to mitigate risk. These are things that companies can do as well as conferences. Companies can also decrease unfair pay gaps by being open about what people are getting for salary and bonuses, and setting clear guidelines about what the criteria are for promotions. By being transparent, it takes the guesswork out of whether things are being applied fairly, and this can also help identify dead ends for certain career paths. Even for technical careers, the usual path is going from technical job to people management. And we can all probably think of someone who followed this path that was not particularly suited for it. Their direct reports may quit, they may quit or burn out, and it's generally a bad situation all around. It's better to ensure senior positions that allow growth within technical skill sets. By understanding where people top out within your organization, you can set things up so people can continue to increase both experience and pay. In underrepresented groups, this can be extra problematic as people get passed over for promotion for reasons that aren't necessarily related to performance. Some people may avoid promotions entirely if they see that managers are expected to be at work for insane hours. Job flexibility is very important for a lot of different types of people. For people who have children or aging parents to take care of, people who don't necessarily excel in a busy office environment, the lack of flexibility may limit their promotion prospects. So allowing people to work from home, even part-time, may improve their ability to get more done. When you think about how someone goes about becoming a doctor, there's usually a very set of obvious steps between graduate high school and start seeing patients. And it usually involves a specific path of education, certification, and apprenticeship. That really isn't the case for security. There's a benefit to this as well as a curse. Most of us never did an internship or apprenticeship. There's a lot of us here without degrees or certification. We learned on our own or we learned on the job. But the flip side is there's some serious ambiguity in what the expected path is. If you look at existing ads for positions at any level, you'll almost invariably see degree requirements or something vague about equivalent experience, which means you're inevitably turning away a lot of folks. So what can we do to turn this around? For starters, hire people who are actually entry level, meaning they have interest and inclination without specific experience. You can also widen what counts as experience. For example, doing projects like making a blog or helping out in a forum or some community group or creating their own security tools. Community college degrees are often seen as less prestigious, but they can often be a lot more effective at training people for a job without the usual hoop jumping that college degrees usually require. I know there are a lot of folks who would argue that you can learn very important things about security, knowing the difference, but it's entirely possible to learn to understand ethics without knowing the difference between Kierkegaard and Kant. For a lot of people, college simply isn't accessible. This may change as more colleges move online, but it's unlikely it'll cease to be a huge financial burden for people in some countries. If you do want to maintain degree requirements, you can help offset this burden by offering scholarships to people looking to get into computer security. or talk to your local schools about what knowledge graduates actually need to be useful to your company. Because technical skill requirements can be a pretty quickly moving target, it might be more effective for colleges to focus on getting students fluent in meta concepts of computer security or computer science, and that way students could gain new skills more quickly without having to constantly update college coursework. Our current system is set up to ensure a huge number of false negatives. People are being pushed out of the pipeline at every stage, and we're failing to detect a huge number of people that would otherwise be ideally suited. The more experienced security practitioners are, the more likely they are to be wary of red flags that indicate a difficult work environment. What can we do to counteract this? Don't expect the right people to come to you. There's a badly worded phrase about doing the same thing over and over again, and yet we post our job listings in the same place over and over again and expect we'll magically start getting more and diverse candidates. By going where the candidates are and by making your company visible to diverse communities, you can find more diverse applicants. And while you're at it, skip the equal employment opportunity type of legal boilerplate if at all possible. The impression it gives is less, we're a diverse workforce, and more, we need to find a token minority, and that usually means a really bad time for the token minority. If you ask 10 security analysts what they do day to day, you're likely to get 11 different answers. To help clarify things, we can start using standardized job description terms. The National Institute for Cybersecurity Education has come up with a workforce framework that makes a common lexicon to describe security work. So if, picking terms from those lists. I think we've all had the experience of looking at a help wanted ad for a security position where it looks like someone took every computer-y sounding word they could think of and made a list out of it. I've looked at job ads for positions that I've left, and I knew that the job didn't require half of what they were calling mandatory. That's a massive mismatch, and if they weren't doubling their salary range, they would be seriously underpaying this person. And lastly, don't forget that interviews are a two-way street. You need to be selling candidates on your company as much as they need to be selling them their qualities to you. It can be helpful to think about what you're ideally trying to do as finding the amazing candidates that everyone else is missing. I can't think of anyone who's more experienced at convincing recalcitrant people to do things that they don't necessarily want to do that are good for them than parents of small kids. If you want to see how creative someone can be at hacking technology to figure out how it falls, technology to see how it falls short and how it can work better for them, talk to someone with vision or hearing challenges. And people with learning disorders have had to learn to do what they need to do with a different set of tools than we're all assumed to have. We're all good at what we do because of our life experiences, not despite them. Incredibly talented, smart, and motivated people are being turned away at a time where we are desperately in need of lots of good people. So how do we make an ad that's really enticing to a wide variety of people? Well, we've probably all heard about ways you're supposed to be able to reword ads to make them more lady-friendly. I'm not entirely convinced that the changes they suggest are gender-specific as much as they're about encouraging community and cooperation rather than competition. A lot of our existing culture, both in and out of tech, tends to value beating out your competition rather than people working together. I think we have a bit of an advantage in anti-malware as there's already an understanding that there's lots to be gained by putting our heads together. By including words in your ad that focus on long-term learning and growth, you're naturally going to increase the variety of personalities that'll find it compelling. Tell candidates how they can contribute to the success of your business or make the world a better place. They can probably skip superlatives and extreme modifiers. Someone doesn't actually have to be the best reverse engineer in the world. They can probably be just a good one and get the job done and for a lot less expensive. Speaking of salaries, start off with telling your applicants your expected salary range. Too many companies make salary negotiations some sort of ridiculous guessing game, and then they disqualify people with no explanation or lowball them after they've already put in a lot of effort. And use accessible text. For example, black on a very light gray background is best for readability. Non-serif fonts are more readable than serif. Left-aligned text is better than justified. Use short paragraphs. Avoid idioms that could confuse people who aren't native speakers of your language. And use bold text rather than italics for emphasis. Make sure screen readers can read all of your text, especially if you're putting in pictures. I talked before about a scenario where the requirements were way off from what the job entailed. Assuming you'd like to avoid that, what should you consider or perhaps reconsider about your job requirements? Let's go back to the educational background. I've talked before about how requiring college degrees is not necessarily a good indicator. Having a bachelor's degree doesn't necessarily mean someone's at a certain level of intelligence or that they have a certain amount of knowledge or work ethic or skill. It's wholly possible they could have taught themselves to do what you need them to do on their own. And then there's the whole X years of experience with Y technology. Is there something magical about that specific number of years? Is there another way you can express it so that people who've mastered the technology in X minus 2 years won't be turned off? How about experience with solving X kinds of problems? A lot of different groups can be turned off by overinflated requirements, especially people who actually have experience. That can be a very clear sign that the companies have really unrealistic expectations and will hold people to unfortunate standards. Certifications can be a good way to ensure that people have a baseline of technical knowledge, but if someone only has 90%, are you going to disqualify them because of that? Some companies are moving towards asking for employees to commit to taking a certification within a few months of starting their job as a way to motivate people to get that additional training. This can also be helpful for positions where other skills are more important than the technical ones. And if you're in an area that's outside of the usual tech meccas, it can really open your options to offer remote work. There have been quite a few studies done in recent years about the effects of remote working to see whether it's actually hurting or helping companies' bottom lines. Any of you who've worked in an open plan probably be unsurprised to hear that people who can choose their own working arrangements are a lot more productive and a lot more efficient. Studies show that teleworking can allow people to decrease the numbers and types of distractions in their day. And it's not just employees that are self-reporting this while they're actually goofing off. 2/3 of managers in one survey reported improvements in their reports as well. Other studies say more than 80% of remote workers reported reduced stress, 80% reported better morale, and almost 70% showed reduced absenteeism. So it should also be no surprise that attrition also decreased by half. Naturally, opening to the possibility of remote work increases your range of applicants since you're removing geographic boundaries, among other things. The thing to be aware of, though, is that remote working can highlight deficits in your existing communication. If yours is a group that tends towards everyone keeping their head down in their own work or having a lack of transparency or ignoring people who don't toot their own horns, these things will likely cause problems. That said, these are not good things to have, and so it could allow you to find these deficits and fix them so that when they're so easy to see. It's really helpful to branch out where you're posting your ads to reach a wider variety of people. While you will reach a smaller number of people on alternative job boards, it'll have much more impact. By showing up where people feel safe, it'll show that their presence is important to you. And I hope this is obvious, but if you're asking security-conscious people to put their data into sites that are not secure, it's generally bad luck. If you use recruiters to find qualified applicants, choose ones who can prove they have a track record of finding diverse talent. Or ask your existing recruiters to start tracking data so that you can, or start providing data so that you can track it. You can also tap networks of your existing employees by giving hiring bonuses to people who give recommendations, especially for diverse talent. Once you've gone through your stack of resumes and started doing interviews, there's a whole new set of things to consider. We've probably all heard horror stories about bad interviews, which is to say, word gets around if your company is being inconsiderate to candidates. It's important to remember interviewees have lives and maybe an existing job that they need to attend to. Don't put undue burdens in terms of either the number or the lengths of interviews. If you do an in-person interview, find a calm and quiet interview site. There's been a trend of going to more informal places to decrease the pressure on candidates, but team interviews that involve drinking in bars or even just busy coffee shops are really not a great place for being able to hear people. Decreasing pressure on applicants is always a good idea, but don't shoot yourself in the foot in other ways. Some companies use in-home tests or quick in-office projects to get a more realistic sense of how people work with others or how they do their job. Done well, this can be a really great way to see people in their natural element, but this isn't an opportunity to score free labor. Keep requests brief. They shouldn't take more than a few minutes to an hour. Especially with people who are new to the industry or maybe younger, they may not have a lot of experience with business travel, or tight finances might cause someone to drop out if they think you're expecting them to drop a lot of cash to travel to a faraway place. Let people know in advance what expenses you'll cover, like parking, gas, flights, hotel, that sort of thing. Err on the side of not making them pay up front. Make sure you're giving all your applicants an even chance. It's a good idea to have a panel of interested parties come up with a list of interview questions in advance. That way you're comparing apples to apples. Take notes while you're reviewing and grade them on predetermined criteria. Then review your impressions shortly after each interview, and if you're having multiple people do the interview, include as diverse a group as you can to get a wide variety of opinions. When you're creating questions or grading your applicants, be sure to stick to job tasks and qualities that actually pertain to what they need to be able to do. For example, people who work with code are seldom known for their fancy dress habits, and personal charisma is not usually a necessity of malware analysis. Of course, that won't be the case if it's a sales job. And please don't ask people to answer trivia questions or come up with obscure facts that they won't actually need to be able to do their job, and they would just search Google if they had to. Once you've hired somebody, you want to get the best out of them. Security is a brain-intensive task, which means people will need quiet time and space to do their job. Open plan offices and meetings that could be an email are the bane of our existence. The reason many of us got into security is because it offers learning opportunities. If we don't continue to learn, we become less effective over time. Make sure your researchers have time and funding to go to workshops, conferences, or community events to keep their brains fresh. Having enough time to do projects that actually fix problems rather than just slapping a Band-Aid on it is very good for our mental health. It's also important to establish psychological safety so employees feel safe taking moderate risks. That means being able to speak their mind without fear of getting their heads bitten off or being ignored. There are few things as wasteful and frustrating as hiring security people and then disregarding their ideas. And yet we all know how often this happens. If you're hiring someone to do security, trust their opinions. Work with them to understand the business case for what they're wanting. Have sponsors both for individuals and for the security group in general. Having someone who can speak up for people when they're not in the room can do a lot for morale and longevity. The things to remember for bringing new people are sort of the repeat of all the things we talked about before. Have a good code of conduct, make sure people know it and understand it, and enforce it when things go wrong. Be clear and explicit about performance goals from the outset. Use the buddy system so that people have someone who already knows the ropes, who can help them get established and feel supported. Check in frequently to make sure they're getting settled in okay and help them find the right resources if they're having problems. So here's a few, wall of text. Here's a few resources. The first few are about helping kids learn about coding. The Project Include has a lot of resources about creating an effective code of conduct and how to improve inclusivity in tech. Black Hoodie Workshop is a reverse engineering workshop for women. AsperGirlsSociety.org has more information about the presentation of autism spectrum in women. I mentioned the Cybersecurity Workforce Framework, talking about the security job descriptions. Remote.co has a lot of information about how to set up teleworking in your org. And the National Center for Women in IT is a great source for statistics about women in technology. They just put out a report last week about girls in K through 12 and computer science classes. And finally, different groups, specific organizations for different groups in tech. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lysa.